This is Harrison with HPY Audio here, back with another episode of DAWs for Dummies. This is episode 3, and today we're going to be covering EQs and dynamic processing. Now the first question that a lot of people might be asking, especially if you're a new audio producer, is what are EQs? EQs, or equalization, is a process in which you turn up and down frequency bands in an audio signal in order to mix it and make it sound better. Now, you might have heard the terms bass, treble, and mids. Now, these terms are used in the equalization process, as bass, treble, and mids are usually the different frequency areas that we turn up and down in an audio signal. The treble being the high frequencies, the bass being the low frequencies, and obviously the mids being everything in between. All of the softwares that we are covering in this series have one or multiple EQs all built into the software, which allows you to put it on every single audio signal that you see fit and turn up and down whatever frequency band you see fit in order to make the audio signal sound better. Now the difference is, in each software the EQs look vastly different, and they might also run and sound different depending on the software that you are using. And I'm going to change the EQ settings to be the same from across softwares. This will showcase how different it is to use EQs from each software, and also how each EQ changes the sound of this particular audio signal from software to software. You'd be surprised at how different some of these EQ sounds, even when all of the settings are the exact same. Dynamic processing is going to be one of the most important parts of your job as an audio producer. Learning how to use compression and gating are vital if you are looking to make effective mixes as an audio producer. Dynamic processing is important because when you record an audio signal, it is not going to be the same volume all the time. This is just natural. For example, if you record someone playing the drums, every single snare hit or every single kick drum hit or anything that they do on the drum kit is not going to be perfectly the same volume every single time. It's the exact same with recording your voice, for example. Your voice is not going to be the same volume all the time. So dynamic processing becomes important for helping this and helping the volume stay at a relatively consistent level. Compression is where you take an audio signal and simply compress the volume down so that it is consistent within a certain volume range. It means that it takes the loudest peaks of the signal and simply moves them back down to a certain volume so that the whole audio signal doesn't go past a certain volume point. This means that your audio signals will be more consistent for their volume and will create effective audio signals for your mixes. Gating affects the other end of dynamic processing. When you set up a gate, it makes sure that everything below a certain volume gets cut out of the audio entirely. Imagine a physical gate that opens and closes depending on the settings you have set. So once the audio signal goes below a certain volume, that gate simply closes and doesn't let through any audio signal that is below a certain threshold. This, alongside compression, means that your audio peaks are not too loud and your audio troughs are not too quiet. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare the compressors and the gates from software to software to show you how different it is to set up and also how different they sound to one another. Okay, we're going to start off with Pro Tools. As you can see, I have all my stems in here. You can see all the waveforms right set up here. I've edited them a little bit, and I've also done a little bit of mixing so far. Let's take the bottom snare. Now let's start off with the EQ. Now as you can hear, it sounds very weak as it is, just from its recording. So what we do is, we change a lot of our frequency bands, move them up and down to create a nicer sounding group of frequencies that are being recorded in the sound. I like to start off with either some low frequency boosts or cuts. I felt like the snare in this regard, it sounds very thin on the low end side, so I added a nice little low end boost. Then I like to go up through the frequency bands to the low mids. Then I moved on to the mids. I gave it a little bit of a boost right in the middle. Now the high mid frequencies, I scooped these just a little bit. I gave them a little bit of boost right in the highs, just to allow for a bit of that snap to come back. This is my compressor. This is the stock compressor for Pro Tools. What I have so far on it is I have a relatively strong compression of about 4:1, It's not insanely strong, but it's strong enough to do some work. The threshold is about negative 19.5 decibels. I've got it on very, very fast attack. As the hit of the snare drum is very fast, the attack needs to be fast. If it is too slow, it simply won't compress anything, as the audio signal from the snare would already be finished by the time the compressor hits. So let's listen to what it sounds like when it's soloed. So, as you can see, that compression is hitting as soon as that snare hits. Everything over negative 19.5 decibels hits that compressor, and it starts to push it back down to that line alongside this sort of grid. It makes the snare fit better with the mix and allows for it to just sit better volume wise. Now let's move on to gating. I have my gate here on channel strip. I have a very, very strong ratio, basically because I don't want that much of anything else to come through. Now, due to the recording quality, a lot of the kick drum bled into the snare mic. Basically, adding a gate allows for a lot of that bleed to be taken out, and the strongest audio signal to really come through, which is the snare. Now, you might be thinking, if you're gating the snare too heavily, won't it affect the rest of the mix? Won't you be able to hear it in the rest of the mix? Well, the thing is that we're simply removing the audio signals from the other aspects of the drums, such as the kick drum and the cymbals. You're already going to be hearing these items come through in things like the overheads and the actual kick drum mics. So simply gating these out of the snare drum won't affect a lot of the rest of the mix. All of the stuff allows for this audio signal to be dynamically consistent, and also to have the problem frequencies turned down and the good frequencies be boosted to create an effective mix dynamically, and also an effective mix based on its frequencies. Now I have the exact same stems up here on Reaper, and I've got the snare bottom stem soloed like I did on Pro Tools. Now what I want to do is I've already got my EQ here. Now although this EQ looks relatively simplistic in comparison to the Pro Tools EQ, it actually has pretty much the exact same features, and even has a little bit more capabilities. Now it may look like there's only 4 bands here, however, the good thing is that you can add as many as you would like. Now, the one in Pro Tools, I was using about 5 different bands. In this Reaper EQ, I can have as many as I would like. And the interesting thing about this EQ is you can also change what type of bands each of these are. There are lots of different options that this provides you with, which I think is very cool and very unique in comparison to a lot of the other EQs that you get as a stock plugin with many different DAWs. Now I'm going to shift all of my bands to be the same as it is in Pro Tools, and we're going to listen to how it sounds. Now let's move on to compression. This is the Reaper compressor. As you can see, it's a little bit less graphic as it is in Pro Tools. It's mainly just a bunch of sliders and a bunch of options. So if you know what you're looking for and you know what it's trying to sound like, this is one that will work well, but may not give you as much visual help as some others. I'm going to change all my settings to the ones I had in Pro Tools, and we'll see how it sounds. Gives you relatively the same result as in Pro Tools. It does sound a little bit different, however, as some of the settings are maybe a little bit different to what you'd find in Pro Tools, and the threshold here isn't set with the same parameters as you'd find in Pro Tools. However, it still gives you a sound that is exactly what you're looking for a compressor. Here we have the Reaper stock gate. This is pretty much exactly the same as you'd find for the compressor. Just like the compressor, it should give us a relatively good result. So I'm going to change the settings to match with what I've done for the rest of the mixes, and I'm going to see how it sounds. One thing I've noticed is that it's actually relatively harsh as a gate in comparison to the one in Pro Tools. However, it works really well and sounds relatively good for a gate, and gets rid of a lot of that noise bleed that you find from the kick drum and the cymbals. Now, I think that although these are a little bit less user-friendly and a little bit less graphical to help new users get a visual feel for what these things are doing to their audio signals, I still feel like these are effective and do the exact job that they're required to, but it might take a little bit longer to figure out than some of the other plugins you'd find in the other ones. Now let's move on to FL Studio. Now I've got all my stems into FL Studio here, and I've got my snare bottom soloed like I have on the others. Now let's move our plugins onto the track. Now they have a lot of plugins, however, the only EQ that I could find, there are some parametric EQs however, but the only proper EQ I could find is pretty much a graphic EQ. Graphic EQs work a little bit differently to any EQ that you might be used to, if you've been working in Pro Tools or Reaper. However, it'll still give us relatively the same desired result. Now, what we need to do is we need to shape every individual EQ band to be similar to exactly what we've done on the other ones. Now, I believe that I've got relatively the same EQ shifts as I have in the others. Now, but it's a little bit harder to figure out exactly what you're doing if you haven't used a graphic EQ before. I still think this is a good EQ, and this gives you control of what all of your frequency bands should look like, rather than just moving up only a few bands at once and having your low shelves and high shelves. This gives you a bit more freedom and a bit more creativity to kind of create an EQ that you enjoy, that sounds a bit more natural, and I think this is a good thing for learning about how EQs work. Now let's move on to the compressor. Here we have the Fruity compressor. I've got the settings down to a point that I'm happy with, and this is what it sounds like with it off. This is what it sounds like with it on. Now this compressor is relatively harsh. I felt like that no matter what my threshold was, it was still compressing it quite a fair amount. I can change my ratio, but then it would also affect the sound in a way that I wasn't happy with. So it gives you the choice of soft, medium, and hard, and also a vintage one. I went with medium as I thought it produced the best sound. Overall, I think this compressor is very simple. Doesn't give you that graphic nature as you get in Pro Tools. However, the options are very simple. The options give you everything that you need, and this is a perfectly fine compressor for anything you might need it for. Now let's move on to gating. I have my noise gate set up. This is on the plugin, the Fruity Limiter. However, this one's a little bit limited in terms of its options. It just has 3 options here under noise gate. It has release, gain, and threshold. However, this still gave me a gated sound, which is exactly what I'm looking for in terms of the snare. I actually really like the sound of this gate in comparison to the other two because it sounds a lot more natural. It kind of simply boosts that snare up and brings everything down in more of a natural way, which is what I like a bit more than the others. Overall, I thought these plugins were a little bit harder to figure out exactly how they fit in, more so than the other ones. I feel like it's maybe not as user-friendly to insert these onto these tracks. However, once you get them working, they sound good, and they're actually really natural, but maybe not as user-friendly as some of the other softwares. Now we have Ableton. I have my stems loaded in here, and we're going to start off with some EQs. I'm going to use EQ8 as it is the most similar to the ones I've used previously, and I'm going to change all of my settings to be as similar as it is to the other ones. Okay, I've changed all my settings to what I have in all the other softwares. Let's listen to how it sounds. Overall, this is a very easy EQ to use and reminds me of a mix of the Reaper EQ and the Pro Tools EQ. This is very user-friendly and has all the options you could possibly want. It's also very easy to find this plugin and insert it onto the track. Now let's move on to compression. Here we have the compressor. It looks very similar to what I've used on Pro Tools before, and it is relatively graphic, so I think this will be easy to use. I'm going to be changing the settings now to match what I've used in the other softwares. I have it at settings that I'm happy with, and this is what it sounds like. Overall, I think this is a very nice sounding compressor. I found it easy to use, easy to find, easy to insert on the track, and I feel like this will be easy for new users to figure out exactly what to do. Now let's move on to the gate. Here we have the Ableton gate. This is a little bit different to what I'm used to, so I'm going to be figuring out how to do it and changing the settings to get a sound that I'm happy with. Okay, I have settings that I'm happy with, and this is what it sounds like. Overall, I think this is a very nice and natural sounding gate. I feel like making the return function right there prevalent is actually a very good feature. This is usually called hysteresis on a lot of other gates, however it is called return in Ableton. I feel like this is very easy to figure out. Having that return function right there will make it easier to get a more natural sound out of your gate, and will allow for a better sound overall to come out of it. Overall, Ableton's plugins are very easy to use, they all share very similar looks, very similar interfaces, and they all allow for a nice, natural, and amazing sound to come out of them. I'm here in Logic Pro. Now, unfortunately, with the way that Apple software works, unless you have a third-party software that allows you to screen record with sound, there is no way that you can screen record your sessions in Logic with sound. This made it almost impossible for me to get footage with sound for all of my sessions in Logic, so unfortunately all I can do now is display the UIs and how the plugins look and how they work. This is the Logic Channel EQ. It is a visual EQ that is super easy and super fun to use. It is an 8-band EQ, which gives you lots of options and lots of variety, and it allows for some really great sounds that can be made with not much hassle and in a visual way that is nice to look at and also very easy to use. This is great for new users to figure out EQs. I'd say this is the best one in terms of usability and also ease of access for new users, as it gives you a nice visual guide for what your EQs should look like for a signal. Moving on to the Logic compressor. I really like this one because it's meant to look like a classic rack physical compressor box. It has all of the options that you would look for in a classic compressor. It sounds great, it's easy to use, everything is labeled very nicely, it looks clean, and it also has different presets, as you can see here. You have your Platinum Digital, which is what is currently being used for, and you also have lots of different presets to get different types of sound. It has side chaining and limiting as well, and it allows for a huge variety of different sounds, whilst still being easy to use, easy to understand, and visually pleasing. This is why I love using the stock plugins in Logic. This would also be very nice to learn for new users, as it gives you all of the options whilst being fun and not complicated. And if you don't like the meter here, you can also change over to the graph setting, which gives you an easy to understand visual graph to go along with all of its other options. Now, in comparison, the noise gate is a little bit more simple. It's still very nice to look at and very easy to use, but it doesn't have that nice aesthetic of the compressor and the channel EQ. So this might be a little bit harder to understand and pick up for a new producer. It still sounds very natural and has all the settings you could want, and it sounds a lot better than some of the plugins we've used in the other softwares. I do think overall it could be a little bit limited in terms of some of its options, and it maybe isn't quite as visual as I would like, but it still sounds great, and I would highly recommend using this while using Logic. Overall, Logic's dynamic processing is super easy to use, sounds great, and is very, very fun to learn and fun to pick up if you're a new producer, as everything is given to you in a fun, visual way that looks nice and sounds even better. Thank you for watching this episode. Today we covered EQs and dynamic processing, including compression and gating, and compared it between each software. I noticed that some of the softwares had very easy to use graphic EQs and graphic compressors, whereas other softwares just gave you a list of sliders and a list of options and expected you to know what to do with them. Now, depending on what you're used to, or depending on what you're trying to learn as an audio producer, these might be easy or hard to figure out depending on what you're after. Having the visual guide of graphic compressors might be a little bit easier to figure out than just having a list of sliders. Now, on to the next episode. Next episode, we're going to be covering effects and plugins as a whole. This is including reverbs, distortions, delays, and everything in between. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you in the next one.